So this question, the paratype question that we are looking at, asks you to find the best place for that sentence. So we understand the sentence, then we understand the paragraph, we find the best place by working out the context in which the sentence does its work. So dualism was long held as the defining feature of developing countries, in contrast to developed countries, where frontier technologies and high productivity were assumed to prevail. Now you understand something here. If developed countries basically were looking at cutting edge technologies and high productivity, then that would be their sole way of progress. They were assumed to prevail. That means progress was happening there because these things were relevant. So dualism therefore then would mean that we might look at this, but we might also look at areas where we don't use advanced technologies or we don't have very high productivity. So that's the defining feature of developing countries. So developing countries are countries in which we may have this, but we don't always have this. We do have the opposites also. We do have slower technologies, we do have slower productivity. So that's what would constitute a developing country, whereas a developed country would basically be looking at this. It's just a statement of what are the characteristics of these, of the comparative characteristics of these two. So at the core of development economies lies the idea of productive dualism. That poor economies are split between a narrow modern sector that uses advanced technologies and a larger traditional sector that characterized by very low productivity. Then we have a statement says, while this distinction between developed and advanced economies, so that means where is that distinction? That distinction is provided here. The distinction is here in contrast to, okay, so as it is, I know that this possibly works over here, maybe, but let's see. While this distinction between developing and advanced economies may have made some sense in the 1950s and 60s, it no longer appears to be very relevant. A combination of forces have produced a widening gap between the winners and those left behind. So would it actually have place in 3? No. The fact is, what is that widening gap? That widening gap is more in the form of, let us say, inequality and differences. So how has that happened? Convergence between poor and rich parts of the country was arrested. That means we aren't looking at equality anymore, and regional disparity is widened. So it can't go into 3, and it can't come at the end of 4, because saying dualism was long held. So the point is, the definitions happen where? The definition could actually happen either in 1 or in 2. So if I say dualism was long held as a defining feature, etc., then I'd say at the core of development economies lies the idea of productive dualism. That means you could have dualism, but let it be productive, right? Where economies are split between a narrow modern sector that uses advanced technologies and larger traditional sector. So it could work in 1, but then 2 says, while this distinction, and that means this distinction is the distinction here. So it's actually best in 2. Now let's read it in 2 then. So at the core of developing economics lies the idea of productive dualism. The idea is being presented there, that poor countries' economies are split between a narrow modern sector that uses advanced technologies and a larger traditional sector characterized by very low productivity. This particular feature discussed here was long held as the defining feature of developing countries, in contrast to developed, where these were the features. While this distinction between developing and advanced economies may have made some sense, there is something else now that has happened. Inequality has come in. So that means 2 is actually the best place for this. So what you want here is blank 2, or in other words, choice 2. Now, it can't happen in 3, because you're saying, having talked about a combination of forces that produce a widening gap, you're asking what is that widening gap? So it can't be this definition. And you're now present to the widening gap. So this definition has no role there, because then we continue to say, as a result, because of the widening gap, policymakers and advanced economies are now grappling with the same questions that have long preoccupied developing economies. How to close that gap? How to close that gap of disparity? So it's not relevant in 4 either. So that means 2 is the place for it, and that's option 2. There's one more here, which is very similar, and probably much earlier, moving the documentation for kissing back 1000 years compared to what was acknowledged in the scientific community. Probably much earlier than what? That means you've talked about the fact of the phenomenon, the social phenomenon happening, or the interpersonal phenomenon happening at some point of time, and probably much earlier, right? Okay, now let's see. Research has hypothesized that the earliest evidence of human lip kissing originated in a very specific geographical location in South Africa South Asia 3,500 years ago. Now, if can it put in one 3,500 years ago and probably much earlier, moving the documentation back compared to maybe. But then let's continue. From there, from where? Because if you say from there, it has to be from some location. So if I put it in one, I am actually stopping with the location. I am saying it originated in South Asia, and then I come down to this and probably much earlier, and then I don't have a location here. Then I wouldn't say from there. So the from there actually has to be the location, South Asia. So it's probably not going to work in one then. Probably not going to work in one. Okay. From there, it may have spread to other regions. Quite right. It originated in South Asia, spread to other regions, simultaneously accelerating the spread of the herpes simplex virus. Right? That means with this, you also got this virus, herpes. So virus 1. According to Dr. Troelsbank Abel and Dr. Sophie Lund Ramundsen, who in a new article in the journal Science draw on a range of written sources from the earliest Mesopotamian societies, kissing was already a well-established practice 4,500 years in the Middle East. Right? Now can it work in 2? And probably much earlier, moving the documentation for kissing back. Right? The documentation goes back 1,000 years. How? In ancient Mesopotamia, people wrote in cuneiform script on clay tablets. Now this line can't work here, because you can't say and because we are talking about the fact of kissing itself. So it can work in 2, but possibly not in 3. So let's consider the possibility of 2 here. Now, many thousands of these clay tablets have survived to this day, and they contain clear examples. So that's the documentation then. So people use cuneiform script, and the cuneiform script forms the documentation to tell you that it was considered a part of a romantic intimacy in the ancient times. That means it supports this. It supports, it seems to have been an established practice 4,500 years ago in the Middle East, and probably even earlier if you look at the documents available. What are the documents available? Cuneiform tablets in clay that tell you that they contain clear examples that it actually was romantic intimacy in ancient times. So kissing could also have been part of that friendships and family members relation, says Dr. Trolls, an expert on the history of medicine in Mesopotamia. So actually, when you consider the way it runs, it can't be in one, because we are saying it started here but it moved there. But then you have new sources, right? You have these people who draw on a range of written sources to say actually it was in the Middle East about 4,500 years ago, well established, and probably even earlier if you look at the documents available. So that means 2 is a possibility. Probably even earlier if you look at the documents available, which is what the statement says, and the documents available are clay tablets which demonstrate that this was also a part then. So it can't work in 4, and it can't work in 3, because 3 would actually disturb the flow between they wrote on clay tablets and what did the clay tablets show. So it actually has to be in 2. Now let's look at what the sequence is, right? So 2 is going to be your place. Now let's look at that. So this research has hypothesized that this human lip kissing originated in a very specific geographical hypothesis. That's theory, right? It emerged only in South Asia, and from there it might have spread to other regions, and also spreading herpes. Now, according to these 2 researchers, who in a new article draw on a range of written sources from earliest Mesopotamian societies, it was already a well-established practice 4,500 years ago in those societies, and probably even earlier if you look at the documents available, and probably even earlier if you look at the documents available in the form of clay tablets, which actually have examples. So 2 is actually the best place for this, right? It can't work in 4 because you've already talked about the clay tablets, and then you're saying probably even earlier. So very clearly, probably even earlier has to relate to a time frame. So 4,500 years ago, probably even earlier, which is what brought us to this possibility here. 3,500 years ago, probably even earlier, but then we say from there. That means from there it may have spread. So if you look at that, this talks about years and not location. So it can't work in 1, but in 2, yes, because here you're saying probably even earlier, and we are not talking about location, change of location here. Probably even earlier when you look at the kind of documents found at that particular, in those particular regions. So 2 is the best place for it, and your option here would be choice 3, because that's where option 2 is. So that's your answer to this question. Now let's look at a jumbled sentence which has one odd statement that we have to find. Now, as we've probably talked about earlier, if the statement is obvious enough, then we don't really have to work on the jumble. But it's not that obvious, then working on the jumble will probably help. So what do we have here? Self-care particularly links to loneliness, behavioral problems and negative academic outcomes. Fine. Latchkey children refers to children who routinely return home from school to empty homes and take care of themselves for extended periods of time. So, if they take care of themselves for extended period of time, then we are talking about self-care linky. So, that means we know 2 and 1 are related. Although self-care generally points to negative outcomes, it is important to consider the bulk of research has yet to track long-term consequences. Now, this is about outcomes. This is about outcomes. This is about the definition of the term and who actually engages in it. Then we might come to outcomes. So, it might seem related, but it will come to after we discuss the phenomenon itself, then we will come to outcomes. Now, in research and practice, the phrase children in self-care has come to replace latchkey in an effort to more accurately reflect the nature of the circumstances, which means 4 and 2 are related and so is 1. So, we have latchkey children, then we say, but now we don't use the term latchkey children, we are actually using other words, we are saying children in self-care. And what exactly is self-care? Self-care is this. So, we know that 4, 2 and 1 are related. In fact, the sequence would actually be 2, 4 and 1. Now, we know that you are introducing latchkey children, you are saying now we don't call them latchkey children, we have a better term for them, children in self-care, and this is what self-care does. Now, what about 5 then? Although parents might believe that self-care would be beneficial for development, recent research has found quite the opposite. What is the opposite? It links to loneliness. Okay, so now I know there are outcomes there. So, we are talking about latchkey children, we are saying that the better term for them is children in self-care. And though parents might actually be that self-care is good, it gives people strength and all that, actually the opposite is true. The opposite is that you actually have negative problems. So, I know that I'd actually go from 2 to 4, right, to 5 to 1. What about 3 then? Although self-care generally points to negative outcomes, it is important to consider the bulk of research has yet to track long-term consequences, which means we haven't quite finished with the discussion yet, because there is still more that we need to know. So, this can only be the start of another paragraph. It can be the start of a related but different paragraph, because this paragraph is going to talk about what are we talking about, what does it provide by basic let us say understanding of the effects, and then a paragraph saying those are the effects, there are long-term consequences that we haven't quite studied. So, 3 is an extension of the discussion. If at all I am going to use it, I will have to use it after I put together 2, what is that? 2, 4, 5 and 1. Therefore, 3 is an extension of the discussion, it is not part of this paragraph. So, 3 then is the answer to this question. So, 3 is the odd statement out over here. Let us look at 20 then. Again, we are looking for the odd statement here. What do we have? The banning of northern lights could be considered a precursor to censoring books for moral worldview or religious reasons. So, northern lights obviously is the name of a book. So, let us not confuse it with the Aurora Borealis, it is probably the name of a book. So, the banning of this book could be considered a precursor to censoring books for moral worldview or religious reasons. Okay. Attempts to ban books are attempts to silence authors who have summoned immense courage in telling their stories. Now, we are not talking about morality here, we are not talking about religious reasons here, we are talking about courage. So, is my passage going to be about morality and what is present in books, or about courage and what is present in books? So, I am not too sure. I am not too sure yet. What about 3? Now, the banning and challenging of books in the US has escalated to an unprecedented level. So, now we have much more banning than we had earlier. So, it could be related to either, so 3 could be related to either 2 or 1. So, 3 could be either 2 or 1. Either way, 3 actually is related to either 2 or 1, which means the difference has to be here, not here. What about 4? The widely acclaimed fantasy novel Northern Lights, okay, which means 1 actually works. 1 works with this. So, I know that I need 1, I need 4 and I do need 3. Why do I need 3? Because 3 actually talks about the extension of the thought itself. So, the widely acclaimed fantasy novel Northern Lights was banned in some part of the US and was the second most challenged book in the US. Now, the American Library Association documented an unparalleled number of book reported challenges in 2022, about 2,500 unique titles, which means challenging has escalated to an unprecedented level and is demonstrated to us in 5. So, we know now that we are talking about a book that is actually banned, and we consider the ban to be a precursor to censoring books. We are also talking about the fact that challenging books has become a very common thing and is at a very high level, and you have evidence of that in this. That means I do have related ideas in, so 1 and 4 are related, 3 and 5 are related, but then 2 is attempts to ban authors are attempts to ban books are attempts to silence authors who would have summoned immense courage in telling their story. This is a different thought. While challenging them on moral grounds seems to be the reason for banning Northern Lights, this one talks about courage of authors, and you are trying to stop them from telling their stories. They've actually, you're trying to silence them because they've had courage to tell their stories. So that's a different thought here. So the exception here would be 2. Now let's work out the sequence here. Now you realize you'd actually want to start with 4 because the widely acclaimed fantasy is this, but it is now the second most challenged book in the US. Second most challenged book because it can be considered to be, this opening up this idea of people really have a moral and worldview of religious reasons. But the fact is, challenging and of books has actually reached very, very high levels, as evidenced by the findings of the American Library Association. So I know I'd actually have these related. The one that is not related is 2, therefore 2 becomes the answer to this question. Okay. Now let's move on. What we have? We have a para jumble. We have to put the 4 statements into order. Again, we read all 4 statements, recognize the links that we can recognize, work out the context, and then the sequence, because we understand what the purpose of the para is. So like the ants that make up a colony, no single neuron holds complex information like self-awareness, hope, or pride. Okay, not too sure where that goes, but let's see. Although the human brain is not yet understood enough to identify the mechanism by which emergence functions, most neurobiologists agree that complex interactions among the parts give rise to qualities that belong only to the whole, which means it's interaction that makes the brain. Okay, how does it actually in some sense connect? Because we are saying we are not too sure that we've understood the brain yet, but almost everyone agrees it's the interconnections that give quality. Now neuron, we know, is one part of the brain. A neuron is one cell in the brain, and no single neuron holds complex information. That means it's only the connection between neurons that actually add up. That means 2 really would normally come after 1, because we are saying no single neuron holds complex information. No single neuron would mean you need more than 1, and therefore it's only because all of them work together that the brain actually does what it does. So we know 2 is going to come after 1. What about 3? Nonetheless, the sum of all neurons of the nervous system generate complex human emotions. Right, that's what the nonetheless does. If it says no single neuron holds complex information, nonetheless the sum of all neurons do that. So the sum of all neurons can actually generate complex human emotions. So we know that 3 is actually related to 1. All right, what about 4? Human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the human brain. Human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the human brain, which is the discussion itself. It opens up the discussion. It says, what is human consciousness? Now you come down to the emergent property of the human brain. Now, where is the neuron? It's part of the human brain. Emergent property, fine. Now, the emergent property is what? Is consciousness. How did the consciousness arrive? Now, no single neuron holds consciousness. No single neuron holds complex information like consciousness. That's what self-awareness is. But all neurons working together can do that, can give you complex human emotions, and none of them can be attributed to a single neuron. So that means 4 is the opening statement, progresses to 1 and 3. And then what about 2? 2 says, although we haven't quite understood the brain yet, we do know that all cells work together in their complex interconnections, which give rise to the qualities that the brain itself has. So we know that we actually want to start with 4, move down to 1, then come down to 3, and then come down to 2. So it will be 4, 1, 3, 2. Let's read in that sequence then. 4, 1, 3, 2, sorry. Yeah, because if you have human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the brain. Nonetheless, the sum of all neurons in the system generate complex, nonetheless, the 3 actually has to follow 1. So, like the ants that make up a colony, no single neuron holds complex information. Nonetheless, the sum of all neurons in the nervous system generate complex human emotions, etc. And putting all this together, so none of this can be attributed to a single neuron. Now, let's just consider that. When you say none of this, so when you say human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the human brain, and you say nonetheless. Now, because we are saying consciousness is a property of the brain, it is actually because all the neurons work together. So, is it possible that 3 could actually come before 1? Let's just look at that. When you say none of which can be attributed to a single neuron. Now, when I say none can be attributed to a single neuron and I pay attention to that, then I say, why do I say it can't be attributed to a single neuron? Because no single neuron holds complex information. Okay, so I realize that it may not really be 1, 3, it could be 3, 1. Now, let's just make a comparison then. I know I am going to start with 4 because 4 says human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the human brain. Now, where does that we seem to consider that the brain does all of this, but the fact is, nonetheless, the sum of all neurons in the nervous system generate complex human emotions like fear and joy. That means you might think it's the entire brain that does it, but actually, even though it's often called that. So, it may be often called, nonetheless, what we do know is that it's actually the sum of all neurons. And why is that? No one neuron, none of these emotions can be attributed to any one single neuron. Why not to one single neuron? Because like ants that make up a colony, no one single neuron holds complex information like self-awareness. How does it happen then? Because it happens because while we not understood it, we realized that you actually have to have interconnectedness, that the parts give rise to the quality that belong to the whole. So, actually 4, 3, 1, 2 is actually a better sequence. Because as we see, when you finalized your answer, make sure you read in that sequence again. Now, if you read in that sequence, you realize that when you go to 4, 1, 3, you got a connection here in 3 which says cannot be attributed to a single neuron. Why is that? Because you have to talk about the quality of a single neuron. It cannot be attributed to a single neuron because a single neuron doesn't have the quality to hold complex information. So, 3, 1 is a better connection than 1, 3, and therefore 4, 3, 1, 2. So, read through it in 4, 3, 1, 2. Human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the entire brain. Even though we call it that, nonetheless, the sum of all neurons is what actually does what it does. But none of this can be attributed to a single neuron. Why is that? Because a single neuron is not capable of holding complex information. So, we come to the conclusion which we might not have understood the brain yet, but we do know there is a connection between all its parts that give rise to the qualities that belong only to the whole, right? So, this confirms why we call it an emergent property of the brain, but it is because the individual neurons can't work. The neurons work together because no individual neuron can work by itself, and the connections actually give rise to the thought processes in the brain. So, 4, 3, 1, 2 is actually going to be a sequence here. All right. So, always remember that when you got an answer in place, before you hit your submit button, just check the sequence for yourself, read through it, check the sequence for yourself, and then you will realize that you might have made a little error at some point, or you might have not, or you might have missed some particular connection here. The connection we missed the first time around was cannot be attributed to a single neuron, has to be explained to me as to why not? Because a single neuron cannot hold that information. So, 4, 3, 1, 2 is your answer to 21. Now, let us look at, no, not 4, 3, 1, 2. So, you realize that we read through the sequence to ensure that we have got it in place. So, human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the human brain. Like the ants that make up a colony, no single neuron holds complex information. Therefore, it is actually the sum of neurons. So, no single neuron holds, but all of them working together can hold. So, nonetheless, all of them working together can actually generate complex emotions, etc., etc. And so, we come to an understanding that although the human brain is not yet understood enough, we do realize that everything working together provides qualities that belong to the brain. So, 4, 1, 3, 2 would be your sequence here. So, that takes us down to question 22. 22. The 4 sentences have to be put in order again. So, now what do we have? Contemporary African writing like the bottle leopard voices this theme using 2 children and 2 backgrounds to juxtapose 2 varying cultures. Which theme So there has to be some theme discussed before this, right? Now, Chukwemka, EK, explores the conflict. Which conflict? Because you're talking about two varying cultures, you're talking about juxtaposing. So, explores the conflict. So, are we talking about the conflict before we say voices this theme? And cast the Western tradition as condescending, enveloping and unaccommodating towards local act and practice. Is that a theme? That means presenting Western tradition as being condescending is a theme. So, could we say that this theme is what contemporary African writing voices using this theme? So, this writing like so and so uses this theme to children, and that means this particular idea is presented in this book. So, we are not going to say you have an idea and you are saying that the idea is this and the idea is present in this book. It is possible. Could I say that contemporary African writing like this and then say this, because it could possibly be that this is the author of that book. So, I am not too sure. I am not too sure how this thing runs until I look at 3 and 4 as well. So, I will just put them there. I have not quite put them in place. Now, however, their views contradict the reality. Right? Whose views? It can't be contemporary African writing. I will have to have writers. And it can't be EK alone, because it is their views. So, however, their views contradict the reality, for a rich and sustaining local African culture ethos exists for all who care to see and experience, which means some people believe that there is no cultural ethos, right? So, Western Christian concepts tend to deny or feign ignorance about the existence of a genuine and enduring indigenous African tradition. So, I know that 4 is what 3 is related to. Western Christian concepts tend to deny the existence of an indigenous African tradition. However, their views contradict the reality, because the reality is that there is a tradition. So, I know that 4 and 3 actually work together. Now, if 4 and 3 work together, then how are 1 and 2 related? So, where do we see the fact that there is actually cultural ethos for all who care? Now, if I look at that, then I know that this conflict between the Western Christian concepts and the fact that African cultural ethos does exist, that conflict is actually explored by so and so. This so and so being EK. So, EK explores the conflict. The conflict between what? The conflict between this thought and the conflict between this thought. So, between these two thoughts, there is a conflict and he explores that. So, EK explores the conflict and casts the Western tradition as condescending, enveloping and unaccommodating towards local African practice. So, he explores the conflict and says this view is wrong because they refuse to see this. Now, that theme, right, is also available in contemporary African writing like The Bottle Leopard. Voices the same theme using 2 children and 2 backgrounds to juxtapose 2 varying cultures, which means we are talking about an example here of an idea that is developed here. So, this is the idea, this is the example, and this idea has come about why? Because there is a conflict that needs to be resolved. So, the conflict is not resolved, the conflict is analyzed in the idea and the idea is given an example of in 1. So, it will actually have to be 4, 3, 2, 1. So, 4, 3, 2, 1 would be your sequence here. That is fairly clear. But now that we put it down, let us read it. So, Western Christian concepts tend to deny or feign ignorance about the existence of a genuine and enduring indigenous African tradition. However, their views contradict reality, for a rich and sustaining local African culture ethos exists for all who care to see and experience. EK explores this conflict and casts the Western tradition as condescending, enveloping and unaccommodating towards local African practice. And contemporary African writing like this book, Bottle Leopard, voices this same theme, the theme that is in 2, using 2 children and 2 backgrounds to juxtapose the 2 varying cultures, right. So, you actually have 4, 3, 2, 1 and that makes sense. So, 4, 3, 2, 1 would be your answer to 22. Now, let us look at 23. 23 is a summary question. So, essence of the passage, basic idea. People spontaneously create counterfactual alternatives to reality when they think if only or what if, which means they are imagining something that did not quite happen, and imagine how the past could have been different. The mind computes counterfactuals for many reasons, more in terms of learning, right. Counterfactuals explain the past and prepare for the future. They implicate various relations, including causal ones, and they affect intentions and decisions. That means you do learn from the past, and if you run an if-only situation, you can possibly prepare for the future. They modulate emotions such as regret and relief, and they support moral judgments such as blame. They do that also. The ability to create counterfactuals develops throughout childhood and contributes to reasoning about other people's beliefs, including their false beliefs. That means actually contributes to false beliefs also. You sometimes give yourself an imaginary what if, and you tend to believe the what if situation. So you can actually get a false belief. So counterfactual thinking helps to reverse past and present actions and reason out false beliefs. Not only that, it doesn't reverse, it might reason out false beliefs, but about reversing past and future actions, no. This part is very clearly, it's not even logical. You can't reverse past and future actions, but you can reason out false beliefs. This part is okay. But just for that, I am not going to look at one because of the distortion here. So probably not one. People create counterfactual alternatives to reality for various reasons, including reasoning about other people's beliefs. But what about false beliefs? So it's only that. Various reasons, including reasoning. So I'll hold on to 2 if I don't have a better choice. 3. Counterfactual alternatives to reality are created for a variety of reasons and is part of one's developmental process. That's about all we can say. You realize there are a lot of things said here. You're saying there are many reasons. They explain the past, prepare you for the future, they implicate relationships, including causal ones, they affect intentions and decisions, they modulate emotions such as regret and relief, they support moral judgments through blame, etc. They also do this. In other words, what happens is that your entire being, it helps develop. So developmental reasons is probably this. So it's part of a person's development process. It actually contributes to reasoning, and reasoning is part of development. So that means they support moral judgments. This ability to create counterfactuals develops throughout childhood. That means people actually do this right through their growth years because of the various things that it actually helps them do. So we know that it has many reasons, and it's actually something that happens as people grow. So 3 is a much better statement than 2, right? What about 4? Counterfactuals help people to prepare for the future by understanding intentions and making decisions. See, both 2 and 4 talk about what this says, but they are not the essence. They are not the essence, they are particular factors. 2 is one factor, which is the one about beliefs. 4 is one factor, which is to talk about intentions. But the totality, if you want to put it into essence, is everyone does this, they've learned how to do it, or they grow up doing it because it has different things that it enables them to do. So 3 is actually the essence of this passage, right? So counterfactual alternatives to reality are created for a variety of reasons and is part of one's developmental process, right? That creating these alternatives is part of one's development process. So 23, your answer is 3. What about 24? Again, you're looking at the essence of the passage. So heat waves are becoming longer, frequent and intense due to climate change. The impacts of extreme heat are unevenly experienced with older people and young children, those with pre-existing medical conditions, and on low incomes significantly more vulnerable. So these are the people who are very vulnerable to heat, rising heat. Older people, young children, people with medical conditions, and people with low incomes, right? Adaptation to heat waves is a significant public policy concern. Research conducted among at-risk people in the UK reveals that even vulnerable people do not perceive themselves as at risk of extreme heat. Therefore, early warnings of extreme heat events do not perform as intended. This suggests that understanding how extreme heat is narrated is very important. The news media play a central role in this process and can help warn people about potential danger as well about the impacts on infrastructure and society. In other words, while there are people who are affected by heat waves and are affected by extreme heat, they don't quite understand that they are vulnerable. And sometimes even giving them advanced information doesn't help them understand. So we need to focus on what do we make them aware of, and how do we go about making them aware, because then they might respond. So that means the methods of awareness building about heat wave and its impact are really important to be able to develop good ways of delivering awareness, right? So is it protection from heat waves is important but current reports are ineffective? No, it's actually that they're ineffective because people don't pay attention to them or they don't get it completely. Now, news stories help in warning about heat waves, but they have to become more effective. Let's look at that. If we say news stories help in warning about heat, right? So it says that even let us say, even the media has a central role to play. Has a role to play. We don't know that they're already doing it. They have a central role to play and can help one. It talks about what they can do. It doesn't talk about what they are currently doing. So, we are not saying that they are currently, they help in warning. That we don't know. They can help in warning, we are told. Now, people are vulnerable to heat waves caused due to climate change. Measures taken are ineffective? No, we are saying that they are not fully aware. So, heat waves do pose an enormous risk, and awareness building is necessary. So, the media plays a pivotal role in alerting people to this danger. The media has a pivotal role. They can alert people to this danger. Now, you would actually ask, what is the difference between 4 and 1 or 4 and 2? Because we are not saying news stories help in warning. We are saying the media can help build that awareness. And if I look at 1, protection is important, but public policies seem, it's not about public policies, it's about awareness. Now, we know we have to come to awareness, and awareness, we can't be looking at 3, because we are saying measures taken are ineffective. So, the awareness is only in 2 and 4. But the fact is, when you say news stories help in warning, but they have to become effective, it's not the stories themselves, it's the media as a tool. The media as a tool can actually help build awareness. So, 4 is the summary of this question. So, with that, we have come to the end of what we were dealing with, and you have had a look at what we went through and the approaches that we had, especially with prioritization. But please do remember, your familiarity with content is what actually makes things easier for you. The wider your reading habit, the more content you get through, the better you are at picking the priorities that you would like, the sequence that you would like to take. So, prioritization is the key, and we tried dealing with that. But the approach itself to each question, you probably have understood by now. So, please factor all that into your preparation. So, thank you and all the best.